Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, and especially anybody watching the World Cup, watching global politics, watching U.S. politics, we're going to get into it with a man that I am very happy and honored and thrilled to finally have joining us on the show, and a very perfect moment for all of that. The great and powerful Ayman Mohyeldin joins us on Independent Americans. Welcome, my friend.
It's great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. Super excited.
So how much did I fuck up your last name?
Not at all. You nailed it. I'm actually quite impressed.
I want to try to get it right, man. I want to try to get it right.
You got it. You nailed it.
All right. Well, dude, first of all, we got a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
World Cup, Iran, insurrectionists, the future of the world and media. But first of all, it's great to have you here, man. I'm really grateful. We delayed this because we both wanted to watch the end of the Morocco game. Holy shit.
What a match, man. I mean, listen, our house, we're I don't know if you know, my wife is from Tunisia. I'm from Egypt. So we have a strong North African love. A lot of our friends are Moroccan. So we've been to Morocco. It's a very special place for us. So we were glued to the TV, watching every minute, watching it all come down to that final penalty kick. And then, like, man, it just erupted. And it was just the two of us, by the way, in the house, but the house erupted.
Dude, I watch you on Instagram, and you are one of my like vacation role models, because I watch you and I see you and your beautiful family. You're going to all these cool places, and I'm like, this guy has got it. But I've seen your connection to many places. And can we just talk about for a minute how big it is that Morocco beat Spain? I mean, beyond, I've been saying all month that this World Cup is about so much more than soccer, but a cultural moment, like a disruption of the power structure. Can you explain, in your view, how big this is?
I mean, I think you nailed it right on the head, because that is the best way to describe it. Look, the World Cup is always about sport, but it's always about so much more than just the sport. And I think in this World Cup, you see throughout every game all of these kind of like cultural undertones and geopolitical undertones, whether it's the U.S. versus Iran, whether it is the U.S. versus England, whether it's Tunisia versus France, and in this case, Spain versus Morocco. So there's always this kind of like little geopolitical flavor to all these games. It's ultimately about the sport, but even within the actual game, like we saw today, Achraf Hakimi, he's the Moroccan player who scored that penalty kick. He has an incredible story. I mean, his parents are immigrants to Spain. We know how sensitive the conversation around immigration is in Europe generally, and assimilation. His family immigrated to Spain. His dad was a street vendor. His mom was cleaning houses. He grew up playing in Real Madrid. And when the time came for him to choose who he was going to represent on the world stage, he didn't forget about his roots and his family's roots. And he decided to play and represent Morocco. And for me, as somebody who lives in America, that kind of thing is really celebrated. I mean, when you look at the American national team, how many American players are representing the United States, but were born overseas or played their club team overseas, but have strong roots to America, and they come back to represent America? And that's the beauty of this sport. That's the beauty of the World Cup. That's the beauty of a game like Morocco versus Spain.
I love that, and I want to come back to it, but I want to also ground us in a question I ask of everyone. Given this global understanding you have and all the world travels you do, you're this international man of mystery. Where are you and how are you?
I'm in New York, baby. I'm at home in Brooklyn. For me, like, honestly, as much as I travel around the world, ultimately New York is home. You know, my kids were born here. It's where my wife and I got married, in the sense that we met and we have a home here. So for me, New York is home. And no matter where I go around the world, and I love to travel, as you know, that, as you said that, I always feel a special connection to New York. When I come back, I just feel at peace. I love the city. I love the people. I love the energy. And I can't describe it. You know, I think you understand this. Like, when you're here, you know, the city, there's garbage. The subway don't necessarily work. It's a bit of a dirty city. It's got a little bit of grit. It's got a lot of grind. But when you're here, man, the people, the energy, you just love it. So I'm in New York. I'm doing well. Can't complain. Family's doing great. Everybody's doing very well. Getting ready for the holidays like everybody else. But we're blessed.
I think New York City is a very intoxicating, vexing, special kind of love affair.
100%.
And it's someone where, you know, the sex is amazing and you have an awesome time, but sometimes it's not good for you. And your friends tell you you should find something else. Like there's a lot to New York, right? And it goes through its waves, because right now the New York City that I'm in love with is Eric Adams' New York City, which is different than Bill de Blasio City, which is different than Mike Bloomberg City, right? But it's something that's in, like, when you once you fall in love with New York, you can't kick it, right?
New York City is not for everyone. It's not for it's for a specific type of person, and I think that's what makes it so special. Ultimately, New York for me is always about the people and the energy and what they bring to the city.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I said this to Andrew Yang in the last episode, I think it's the best place in America to watch the World Cup. I mean, maybe one of the best places in the world. It's different now because it's wintertime and not the summer. But in the summer, everybody's out in the streets watching games. Every neighborhood, all the communities are intersecting, right?
But you know why? New York is such a microcosm of the world, and the World Cup is about bringing people together. And I think in America, there is no city in America, or quite honestly in the world, that brings the world together like a New York City. And it's exactly like you said, man. You just walk around any of these neighborhoods. I live in a predominantly Italian neighborhood, Italian American neighborhood, and you walk here and bars have the games on and people are speaking Italian and people are cheering. And that's not, and Italy's not even in the World Cup this year, but there's so much love and respect for diversity and culture, and people appreciate what the World Cup represents. And you really do get a flavor of that here walking around New York City.
And it maybe is one of the few truly shared positive global experiences we have. Maybe the most true, right? I mean, other than
I would
wars,
argue yes, and I'm biased because I'm a huge soccer fan. I'm a huge World Cup fan. Yeah,
but I there's nothing. I mean, something like the Super Bowl in the U.S. can't even compare. I mean, wars, maybe can compare. Huge natural catastrophes, but it doesn't have that captive audience and everybody having that shared language. I mean, the one thing I've said is in many countries, you can always talk about sports. You can always talk about the weather, and you can always talk about family, right? Like, because everybody, for the most part, has a family, and everyone's affected by the weather. So wherever you are, you can say, oh, it sucks that it's raining. It's beautiful that it's sunny. And you have this common language among most of the world for at least a couple of weeks, which is really special. But I want to ask you to go deeper on the politics of it too, because I've been reading everything you're writing. I think you've been a really important voice. I think you ask a lot of hard questions that almost no one else, at least in the national media, is asking. Can you talk about what the World Cup means for especially America and the world's understanding of the Middle East? And, you have lived in Qatar and you've been talking a lot about it. Can you break down, in your viewpoint, just what this means and what you think are some of the most important storylines around that?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, look, I think we should rightfully talk about the World Cup in all of its complexities. Nobody is saying do not have those conversations. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I think when we talk about the World Cup, we should talk about it from a few different angles. And I think we should be honest with ourselves as to whether we are having these conversations like we would if the event was being held in our country or in Europe or elsewhere around the world. And let's start with the way countries bid and win the World Cup. And this obviously pertains to FIFA. FIFA is the governing body of global soccer. They're the ones that put on the World Cup. They're the ones that decide which countries host the World Cup. And by all accounts, FIFA is an extremely controversial organization. It has been the subject of intense scrutiny, intense investigations, criminal indictments in the United States. A lot of people describe FIFA as a very corrupt organization that has corrupted the process of how countries ultimately win the World Cup. So let's be clear about that, because I don't want anyone to say like this is a justification or an explanation of why Qatar or other countries have won the World Cup. In doing so, it is important to say, let's target the conversation about FIFA, how FIFA can be better, how FIFA can do this more transparently. But to single out one country saying, well, this country got the World Cup illegitimately, when you're not taking into consideration how other countries got it, including the United States in 1994, as well as the kind of secondary conversations that people say, like, Qatar doesn't deserve to host the World Cup. And when you ask, why doesn't a small country like Qatar deserve to host the World Cup? They will make arguments like it doesn't have a strong soccer tradition. It doesn't have a sports culture. It doesn't have a prestigious soccer league. And those are not in my opinion, valid arguments for what the sport is about. America did not have a professional soccer league when it hosted the World Cup in 1994. In fact, the World Cup allowed America then to turn around and launch MLS, which has been a huge success and could potentially be bigger if Messi and Ronaldo ultimately come and play here, as is often reported. So we'll see. But my critique of the coverage has been around two things. One, not applying a uniform standard in the criticism of Qatar, but also using sometimes Orientalist and stereotypical tropes about the Middle East. And we can get into that a little bit, at greater lengths. But there's always this tendency to reduce the Arab world to stereotypes and tropes. And it's tries to paint the region as monolithic. You lived in the region, the Arab world is made up of, nearly 24 countries. Everyone has a very different history, different geopolitical interests, different culture. Yes, shared language, shared religion, but very different backgrounds and objectives as countries and societies. And then there's the discussion around human rights, LGBTQ rights, sustainability. And again, these are all very valid questions. They're all very valid criticisms to be had. But it's important to put them in the proper context, and not just singling out one country that is part of a larger regional ecosystem that requires, being overhauled and then ultimately being addressed. And here's what I mean by that. You and I, we live in America. We know that America has a lot of systemic problems, whether it comes to criminal justice, social justice, race relations, income inequality. These are systemic problems baked into the American system. And yet nobody ever says, because of these systemic problems that we have, we can't try to move forward. We can't try to progress. We aren't making progress on them. Or we should be stripped of any position that we have globally because we are unable to address our systemic problems internally within our own country. So the arguments of people to say, let's boycott Qatar, let's strip the World Cup away from them, they don't deserve this, and constantly criticizing, it reduces the conversation around the World Cup to these, I think, very simplistic talking points that do a disservice to both the people genuinely trying to spotlight the issues and looking at whether or not there's actual progress being made in these systemic problems that I think Qataris will tell you they are aware of and they need to improve on.
Thank you for all of that. I think that for many folks, that's not an analysis they're hearing. And that's part of why, frankly, I do this show, is to try to open the conversation in different ways. And also, to some extent, to connect the dots. And one of the big storylines in the World Cup has been Iran. And this is a show we always focus on national security and global security and human rights. And we've been covering what's happening in Iran, inside Russia, in China. Can you, Ayman, in your view, frame up what is happening in Iran right now? And I am consistently shocked by the lack of not shocked, but disappointed in the lack of coverage here in the U.S. Similarly, for most conflict areas, I was supposed to be on a network today to talk about Ukraine, and then there's a murder mystery happening in Iowa, which I'm sure is important to that community, but it doesn't have the global implications. Right. And Iran is, at least in my view, the closest thing I've seen in my lifetime to a revolution. I mean, it feels like it's happening, what many of us have hoped for, rooted for, tried to support in whatever ways. Can you frame up what it is that you think is happening in Iran and what happens next?
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, what is happening in Iran is actually quite simple. It is a people who have been oppressed, who have been denied their most basic fundamental human rights, who are rising up and saying enough. They don't want this anymore. They don't want to be oppressed. They don't want to be held back. They don't want to live under this draconian, oppressive religious rule that has been imposed on them for the better part of the last 40 years. And this is a movement that is being led by young women, girls, students, professionals, and ordinary Iranians who are saying they don't want to live in a country that is ruled as a theocracy anymore. That's the general premise of what is happening right now. And it all started because it has been building up for years. But, in moments of revolution, we can never anticipate what the spark or what the triggering moment was. And in this particular case, it was the death of this young Iranian woman, Masa Amini, at the hands of what people believe to be the morality police. The allegation was that she was taken in because she was not properly wearing her head covering. And while she was in police custody, she was beaten, and ultimately that led to her death. And because there was so much anger around the circumstances of how this young woman was just killed, and with complete disregard for her life and what her life means, people have taken to the streets demanding not just immediate justice for her, but justice in the broad sense for the society that has had to deal with this kind of oppression and these types of killings for years. So that's the general premise of what is happening. Where this goes from here, I think honestly is very difficult. One of the challenges, and it's not to dodge the question, but it's to kind of explain the question to the point that you raised about the coverage. One of the hardest things about Iran as a journalist is that Iran is an oppressive, closed society. We don't have journalists there. People often compare it to Ukraine. And I say, well, yes, Ukraine is a group of Ukrainians, people fighting for their freedom and defending their country and democracy against Russian aggression. And that is what is happening in Iran, with people fighting against their oppression and seeking their freedom. The difference is there are hundreds, if not thousands, of journalists on the ground inside of Ukraine who are able to see, report, document, speak to Ukrainians, and get that message to the outside world. Iran is it's a closed society. Western journalists can't just get in there easily. We are relying on a network of Iranians who are shooting and filming and documenting these atrocities by themselves for the world to see. And that creates that much more layer of difficulty, if you will, in trying to get that word out to the world. Because as you can imagine, there's process of verifications, there's process of authenticating, there's process of making sure you're getting the proper context as to what is actually happening in real time when you hear stories that are heartbreaking and troubling. So it's just one of the many challenges. And I think the other challenge is that we are realizing, like we did in the 9/11 era, as a journalist who came up in the post 9/11 world, we don't have enough journalists who are Iranians working in Western newsrooms who can explain and understand and know the language and know the culture, know the nuance, and know the politics of a place that is as complex as Iran. So those are just some of the layers. And again, I don't want to dodge your question about where does it go from here. I just feel it is very difficult for me to answer that question. The protesters and the people who are leading this revolution, they are Iranians who say they are not going to settle for anything less than a complete change to the regime and a complete change to their governance and the way that their country functions and rules over them. I think the Iranian regime right now is not sure how to respond to this. This is a government that has in the past used deadly force and used deadly violence to suppress uprisings. This uprising is different, or this revolution is different, or this protest movement is different. But the Iranian government so far has not unleashed the same deadly force that it is known that it could possibly do that. And I say that knowing that the Iranian government has already killed hundreds of people, including children. It's engaged in all kinds of allegations of human rights abuses and systemic abuses. But the fear is that it is also a country that is willing to and has demonstrated it has the ability to suppress movements and protests with deadly and lethal force. So I am not sure where it goes yet.
The heroism, I think, is hard to comprehend. I think Iranians, at least in the American media stage, may be among the most misunderstood and stereotyped people, at least in my lifetime, I feel like. Do you think, Ayman, that we see, I mean, this is a hard thing to answer for too, but, you could argue the regime, wants to let it burn out and doesn't want to crush it and create an even bigger uprising. But do you think Iran will be free in the next decade? In our lifetime? I mean, how, when you look at it and you talk to people on the ground and around the world, what does your gut tell you and your expertise tell you? Because I feel like for many people in America, they feel like it's absolutely so far away. It's North Korea, and it's not, in at least in my limited understanding. So how possible is a free Iran soon and in our lifetime?
I think, look, I am a person who believes in freedom, right? I mean, I know that sounds very simplistic, but I believe societies move towards freedom, and they move towards freedom at different paces. Obviously, I lived through the Arab Spring in 2011 when we thought that was going to be a pivotal moment for the Arab world to actually introduce new democratic forms of government. And maybe naively so, the anti-democratic forces in the region, the anti-freedom forces in the region turned out to be stronger than we had thought. But that doesn't mean the people who are in the Arab world aren't yearning for freedom and democracy and a better system of governance in a lot of these countries. I think Iran is in the same boat. I think Iranians are a proud people who come from a proud tradition of a successor to ancient empire and civilization. When you have that kind of history, when you have that kind of education, when you have that kind of sophistication, the desire to be free is not something that can be suppressed so easily. So I think that, yes, I think in our lifetime, we will see a free and democratic and equitable Iran. Is it going to be tomorrow? Is it going to be a week from now? Is it going to be a year from now? I can't answer that question, just the same way I couldn't have predicted the triggering mechanism behind the Arab Spring nearly 12 years ago. But I did see the result of that movement, and it confirmed for me that the people in the region yearn to be free, yearn to live in more just societies, economically, socially, and politically. And I think the Iranians are exactly the same and deserve exactly the same.
Ayman, building on that, I mean, you've been celebrated for your journalism, and I think you have a really unique feel and expertise in understanding the evolving political, social, military landscape that we face. I mean, from Iran to the uprising to your time on the ground in Iraq. I mean, I was telling you in advance of this conversation, we were looking back at your thesis, right, from 2002, that was the new media paradigm and the war on terrorism, right? I'm not going to go into your thesis, but to say that you've been thinking about this and studying this for a long time. And the construct in this country around what terrorism has been about Muslim people attacking Americans for a long, long time. Now, here we sit almost exactly 2 years since January 6th, and we're facing what I have called the American insurgency. And I call it that because it is, in my view, a true insurgency. You've got a group of organized, militant people who are focused on overthrowing the government. And you have to call it what it is. And that's what I think this is, led by Trump and fueled by the Oath Keepers and propelled by so many components. You also have this unique understanding where you grew up in Georgia, right? And in the country of Georgia in America. So you know about some of this and you've covered this. Can you frame up what you think is happening in this country? I've called it the American insurgency. I think it's the number one national security threat. We saw some kind of an attack in North Carolina on critical infrastructure this week. We're recognizing the January 6th police heroes this week. But the country, I think, is underestimating the potency and the growth and the dynamism of extremism in this country, where it's Americans attacking other Americans. How do you view all this, man?
Yeah, listen, I mean, I agree with everything you just said there, right there. One of the things that I try to frame for people on my show and in conversations I have on the air is that we tend to think of America as an old country, a country that has been tried and tested for almost 240 years. And I think that is misleading. And the reason why I say that is America is an old country, but America has not been a country for all of its citizens with all equal rights, women and men, people of all walks of life, only for the last 60 years. I mean, since the 1960s is when we've had full equality in America. Mm-hmm. And when you contextualize that, when you think of, yes, America had been around for 200 years or 150 years plus, but that was only for white men. And then it included white women, but it didn't include minorities. It didn't include Black people, it didn't include Black women, it didn't include people of color. And only in the last 60 years have we become a multiracial, multi-ethnic, democratic society with equal citizenship under the law. And that is a relatively young country. 60 years or so is a young country in a country that is 300 million plus people. And when you look at it from that perspective, you can begin to see that we may not be doing as well as we think we are in terms of a functioning, healthy democracy that represents all of our citizens. We need to do better at making sure everyone has a right to vote, everyone's voice is being heard in the process, everyone is being represented equally in that process. When you look at some of our fundamental problems, democratically speaking, The Electoral College is out of date. This was a system designed when we were 13 colonies and maybe about a million or so citizens. We're now 330 million Americans plus 50 states. The Supreme Court is nominated by presidents who have not, the majority of the Supreme Court justices are nominated by presidents who did not have the popular vote, meaning they did not have the majority mandate to govern or to nominate someone, confirmed by a Senate that represents nearly 40 million less Americans than the minority party. So when you start thinking about, well, how are we making our decisions as a country? Is it majority rule? Is it majority rule and is it minority rights, which is kind of what we think of our democracies, that we always want the majority to make the decisions. That's how we get consensus. But at the same time, the minority is represented and respected. Are we really fulfilling that? And I think it's a safe argument to say we're falling short. So when you take that, coupled with the rise of what the FBI says, white nationalism, extremism, white supremacy, fueled by demagogues like Donald Trump and others within the Republican Party, coupled with the disinformation that we're seeing and the income inequality, which leads to people becoming more destitute in this country, we are in a very dangerous time where extremism is on the rise. And this is something, going back to my thesis a little bit, it's something that I'm sure you and I have seen in the Middle East. The Middle East for a long time had destitution. There was definitely disinformation and manipulation, certainly religious manipulation. And you had the demagoguery of extremist leaders like Osama bin Laden and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and all these other terrorist leaders who came in and manipulated people with this religious ideology, use people who are down on their luck and destitute and say, hey, we can fix this if you follow us. Let's go attack our enemies. And what you're seeing now in this country is something similar brewing. People that are destitute, they're prone to disinformation. They're following demagogues who are telling them, I alone can fix it. This election is not real. These people are taking our jobs. We have a serious crisis and we have to use violence or have to use any means we can to stop this country from going down this road. And I think to your point, this is what we're seeing happen. It's what the FBI is worried about in terms of the rise of domestic terrorism and white nationalism. It is the biggest threat I think this country is facing. And I think even the statistics of the number of attacks reflects that reality as well.
Yeah, Ken, we were honored to have Ken Burns on this show a couple of weeks ago, and he talked a lot about grievance and about the weaponization of grievance and the power of grievance. And we've got this very deep grievance among a population that's disproportionately angry white men who don't feel like they have a connection to the future of this country. And they have an access to guns that is so dwarfs what I had to deal with in an insurgency in Iraq. It's almost incomprehensible to me. So the opportunity and the environment that exists for an insurgency and extremism to grow, I think, is still underestimated by people, especially in places like New York and California. So let me ask you to build on this in one way, Ayman. You've been great at explaining to America Iran, explaining to America the Middle East. Can you explain to people what you know about Georgia that you think people might not know about Georgia? Because by the time this airs, the election may have been settled between Warnock and Walker. I view it as one of those places that is uniquely ripe for independence and for people who are dissatisfied with both parties. But you've got this epic matchup in a state that is in many ways, an insight into America. But what do you know about Georgia and want people to know about Georgia that they might not unless they've lived there and been there like you?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I went to high school in Georgia and my parents still live there. I still go back, a couple times a year. In fact, when we first moved to Georgia, it was in 1993, just as Newt Gingrich was, basically leading the contract with America back in the early 90s and sweeping the Republicans into power. Georgia is a complex state, and it's a complex state because exactly what you said. It's a cross section of so many of the geopolitical forces in our country. You have this urban area that is predominantly African American. You have a growing suburban community that is diverse. Georgia's economy is doing very well. but it is also a state with a very strong conservative tradition, religious tradition, which informs and shapes its conservative politics. And so it is at the intersection of all of these different tectonic plates that we're seeing in this country, between urban versus rural, between African American and white, between suburban and urban, between minority communities. And as the demographics in the state change, you're seeing the politics of it change. So Georgia, people forget, Georgia was also a state that had Jimmy Carter, who was by any means a progressive Democratic president in the 70s, become president of the United States. And he wasn't he was not a conservative Democrat. He was a progressive Democrat. He was talking about like climate change in the 70s. Yeah. He was talking about things that.
But he was a populist too, right? He was a peanut farmer who went to the Naval Academy,
exactly.
Right? And there's part of what I've been talking about and writing about is my shock and fascination about how little people are not only talking about Jimmy Carter, but about Max Cleland, who was a Democrat elected in Georgia, but Max was elected in part because he was, transpartisan. I mean, he was a triple amputee, he was a Vietnam vet who talked like he was from Georgia. He loved Georgia. And I've lived in Georgia. When I first got home from Iraq, the first place I set foot on was Georgia. And there seems to be this, maybe it's just a lack of understanding of Georgia, but I haven't heard Max Cleland's name once. When you talk about how can Democrats win back the Senate, you hear Stacey Abrams and everyone else, but nobody looks at Max Cleland as an insight into Georgia as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing is Georgia has this long history and tradition of electing those types of Democrats. And I think that if the new face of the Democratic Party in Georgia, I mean, look at the two candidates that you have. You have John Ossoff and you have Raphael Warnock. Mm-hmm. And I think they represent both of the kind of new Democrats that are emerging in a state. But Georgia is all about voter participation. And if you can get more people to participate in the process, which really is the challenge of America, to have a more representative democracies, how do you get more people to turn out? There is a reason why this controversial anti-voting or voter suppression bill, SB 202, was passed following what happened in 2020. People saw the turnout and are trying to, in a very simple way, change the reality of votes. And people think like, oh, you have to try to make up or remake the composition of Georgia. Joe Biden won Georgia by approximately 12,000 votes. I mean, that's what Donald Trump wanted Brad Raffensperger on that infamous phone call to find him, more or less, 12,000 votes. So if you can peel away 12,000 votes from different parts of the state, Republicans can hold on to it, or at least suppress the vote enough that you don't get those 12,000 votes, and you can have a very different reality. So Georgia, for me, I think is the epicenter of so many things happening in America. It has massive corporations, has a strong military presence. It is a cultural hub in this country, both cinematically and musically, and has such a deep and historic tradition. It has some of the most sensitive racial fault lines that this country has had to experience. Yeah. It has a dynamic economy that is changing. And as I mentioned, so many forces between urban and rural and urban and suburban. So it is a place to watch. It's not an easy place to understand, but it is a very important place to watch.
I really appreciate your insight into all of this, Ayman, because I think you've been really important in helping to explain things to America. And I think in the media too often there are people who are preaching at folks and not necessarily explaining it and trying to break it down and push the groupthink and the collective understanding. Building on that too, something I wanted to talk to you about is, you represent, I think, kind of a next generation media figure, right? I mean, you're not shy about your personal opinions. You're on MSNBC, so that's a forum that comes baked into it, a certain expectation and a certain kind of audience. But are you an activist journalist? How would you describe the way you're able to meld in the things that you care about with your coverage of the news? Because I do think, I think you're one of the only people I can watch on MSNBC at times. Sometimes I feel like you're great for MSNBC, but you also don't fit there. And I look at this as an independent media guy, right? A guy who's been on MSNBC. We've talked about this. I've been a guest there for 20 years, and I've never been a host. But I also feel it moving in different directions, like we feel CNN moving, like we feel Fox moving. So can you just maybe explain to us, what's your approach? Like, how do you look at that seat that you hold, and how do you look at what you are on the journalistic landscape in America?
I really appreciate that. I mean, look, I think for me, I am somebody who grew up with one foot in America and one foot in the Middle East. I grew up traveling between both cultures, and part of the philosophy that informed so much of my reporting at an early age was that I genuinely believed that I had to see and hear the other. When I was in the United States, I have to try and explain the Middle East to the United States. When I'm in the Middle East, I try to explain some parts of the United States to the Middle East. And I've always seen myself as this kind of conduit between cultures. Trying to explain to people in the Arab world how the Electoral College functions is not an easy job, right? And to be honest with you, I'm not sure I can explain it to Americans either, but nonetheless, it's a challenge. And so I've always viewed myself as somebody who wanted to bridge that gap. And in the early part of my career as a reporter and as a news anchor, I very much focused on how I can do that through my reporting. Luckily, in the last year and a half, I have transitioned away from news in the classic sense of reporting on events to perspective. And I am allowed now, because the company has given me the space and the show to do so, to express my opinions and to share my perspective on the events that are happening in the world and around the United States. And it's an important distinction to make for our viewers, because sometimes we just kind of look at the media as one monolithic landscape. And that's not really the reality. Is I fall now in a department of perspective programming. So in some ways, it's kind of like turning to the op-ed page of a newspaper. Mm-hmm. When you are watching me, you're getting my take on the world and my take on current events. It's not just simply reporting what is happening, which is what I did for the first decade and a half of my career as a reporter, both in the Middle East and here in the United States and elsewhere. I mean, I've reported from Europe and South America and Asia. So that is how I would see it. The difference also is that I am coming up at an age as a journalist with social media, and I think for a lot of us, that's it's a new tool, it's a new resource, it's an ability to extend our platform of speaking. I have my show on the weekends, but I can't just sit by for the entire week and not consider the world around me and talk about the world around me. And so with social media, I have the ability to make the observations that I want to make and that I do make on my show throughout the course of the week. And in the same, tonight, for example, in a couple hours, I'm going to be going overnight to anchor our special coverage of the Georgia runoff results. So it's a 24/7 job, and we have the resources now to make that job, throughout the day as events happen. And we try to stay on top of that in real time. And that's certainly how I view myself, both editorially, what I try to bring, the context and bridging the gap and challenging us to look at things from a different perspective, but also the fact that this is a 24/7 job, and I like to use that platform as much as I can, whether it's social media as well as the linear broadcast side.
Well, I think you're using the platform in ways that are really innovative, but even more so, your example, I think, has been so important and courageous.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you.
And a role model for our kids. I mean, you're out there doing stuff that I think spans far beyond the news and politics and is about the culture. And Rossi is a good friend for both of us, who's been a guest on this show, who's a master of the culture. And I think you're really a critically important voice for this country and for the world right now. And I'm grateful for all you're doing. I hope you'll stick around for a couple quick fire questions for our Patreon members. And I got to let you go pick up your kids. But before I do, you also are a father, and you've got little ones like I do. Any insights or lessons learned from this last couple of years, just as a human being, as a person, things that got you or your wife or your family through this that you would, give as advice or recommendations to others?
Honestly, the one thing I can say with confidence is there is no one way to parent, but at the core of how you parent is that you just have to love your kids and support them and understand that they develop personalities and they are beings in their own right at an early age, right? I think I will be the first to admit that I struggle sometimes. Am I over-parenting? Am I not parenting enough? Should I encourage them to do more of this? Should I try to project onto them the things that I like? I mean, I love to watch the World Cup. I want my kids to sit down and watch the World Cup with me, but I don't know if I'm like projecting on them what I want them to do, or do I want them to come and celebrate this moment with me and enjoy it? So I am like any other parent. I'm still trying to figure this out. So I can't say that I'm by any means in a position to give people advice. But one thing that I am very confident about is that if you ultimately love your kids, they will grow up to be the best version of themselves. Sometimes you just have to tell your kids you love them and let them be who they are without trying to project onto them what you want them to be or what you want them to be doing at any given moment. And that's a little bit hard sometimes, you know. And I also want my kids to recognize their roots, and I want them to always remember and recognize the sacrifice that their grandparents have made for them. Because you know, I always think about this, and it's kind of tangential to your question, but as the son of immigrants, I always think as an immigrant myself, I was born overseas, but my parents brought me here at a young age. I often think of, do I have what it takes to immigrate to another country the same way my parents did with us? I mean, my parents immigrated to the US. My dad was in his 40s. He was younger than what I am now, and he had already had 2 kids. And I say to myself all the time, do I have the courage to do what my mom and my dad did in going to a country they had never been to before, to raise 2 kids in a completely foreign country, simply because they believed in the vision and the promise of that country? And for me, it is the ultimate sacrifice, because immigration for me is all about paying it forward to the next generation. There is no other act in the world that comes as generous as saying, you know what, I know that my life is going to be hard by immigrating to a foreign country, but I'm doing this because I believe the promise of that country for my kids and their kids is going to be better off. And I never want my children to forget the sacrifices that their grandparents made for them to be able to grow up in a country like the US and be who they want to be and do what they want to do.
Thank you for sharing that. You have no doubt you have that courage. That courage is baked into you, and it's going to be baked into your kids. And it's a great example for all of us in a time where we need courage and we need courageous examples. So you're living it, man. I'm really, really grateful you joined us. I'm thankful to have you as a friend. I'm inspired by what you do. So much, and this World Cup shit is just bonkers and so much fun, and it's great chopping it up with you about that too.
Listen, we still got a couple more weeks of this, so enjoy it while it lasts, man. We got some exciting quarterfinal matchups.
That's it, man. Well, you should do a sports show. You and I could chop it up and do a sports show. Maybe MSNBC could use a little more fun and flavor. So maybe
I agree. I agree.
Make a phone call or two. We'll chop it up. But until then, Ayman, thank you for all you do, my friend. All the best, and stay vigilant, my friend.
Thanks, brother. Take care.